pretty wet.
Okay, colleagues, I'm going to call this meeting of the LPSB Budget Committee to order. I just want to give an overview of how we're going to proceed tonight, and then we'll get right into it. So we're going to have a presentation from LPS about the budget, the draft budget that's before us. After the presentation, which will take a little while, we're going to have some questions from board members if they have any questions about the budget that they want to clarify before. And then we're going to open it up to members of the public. So if members of the public have questions or comments about the proposed budget, they can come up to one of these microphones, either up top or down here. You can ask your questions or make your comments up to 5 minutes. And we will keep a timer, so try and stay within the 5 minutes. And then at the end of the session, if there are a whole lot of questions, we'll hold them all to the end, and then we'll have the staff respond to clarify any of those things and answer those questions. So that's how we're hoping to proceed. Any questions off the top in terms of the structure of the meeting? Okay, go ahead.
Hey, just by way of introduction, we've been working closely with Kim Darling, who we brought as backup this evening, our Director of Finance, and other senior managers from across the service for several months in putting together what we believe is a responsible budget that balances the fiscal responsibility with what is required to ensure adequate and effective policing services for the community. Let me first say that we are always mindful that the police budget represents not an insignificant portion of the municipal tax levy. Policing is an expensive business, there's no doubt, and there are competing demands for municipal services outside of policing, obviously. We must also recognize that there are increased demands being placed upon the police service and upon the women and men who work on the front line. It's our job to ensure that we have the resources in place, whether that is staffing, equipment, or technology, to ensure that they can do their job not only as efficiently and as effectively as possible, but also as safely as possible. The safety of our members and the safety of the public is our top priority. And by way of background, our core activities are guided by requirements under the Adequacy Standards Regulation of the Police Services Act and are shaped into actionable goals within our business plan, or more correctly, the board's business plan, which is our strategic roadmap. Our business plan is a public document that is available online and was developed after extensive internal and external consultation, including with members of the public, community groups, business groups, and a variety of players almost 2 years ago. As the administration, it is our job to operationalize that plan, which is what the budget is really all about. So just as community needs and expectations informed the development of the plan almost 2 years ago, your input tonight is important. So I thank those of you who have taken time to attend tonight. And sir, I hope you have a lot of questions. I'll turn it over to Deputy Chief Betts in just a minute, but I want to thank Director Kim Darling and her team, as well as some of the senior officers who, we have 4 or 5 here tonight, for the work that they have put into the budget over the last few months and continue to. I know there have been many long days and weekends, so thank you. And also thanks always to Rick Robson, who is here tonight as well, from the London Police Association, for his support and the association's support for working together with us for the betterment of the organization and the community. So with that, I'll turn it over to Deputy Chief Betts.
Thank you, Chief. We'll just get started, then we'll get right into it. And thank you for those who have come today to participate. We value your input, and we will endeavor to ensure that what you're presented with today makes a cohesive picture of what it is that we need to do in the coming years. So, our presentation today will focus on 3 strategic themes: community safety and quality of life, employee wellness, and value for money. Keep in mind that police are tasked with 5 core responsibilities in the Police Services Act, as the Chief outlined, and they fall within the Adequacy Regulation 3/99, specifically crime prevention, law enforcement, victim assistance, public order maintenance, and emergency response. The budget process is fairly lengthy and extensive, as you can see starting in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. It starts with community consultation and surveys. Those form the basis of the business plan. As the Chief mentioned, we engage with stakeholders throughout the community, engage environmental scans. We try and forecast future pressures, be that legislation that's pending or other pressures that are on the horizon. And we try and match our budget resources to the implementation plan for the purposes of that strategic plan. As you'll see then, as we move through that budget process, we seek input from divisional commanders, and they forecast what their pressures will be in the coming 4 years. Requests are submitted, and I can tell you that not all requests are able to be met, but we do our best to ensure that we can provide a consistent, efficient, and effective police response in our community. We pass that through the analysis and review of the submissions, and then today it takes us to the community presentation and feedback. Following today's presentation, we will present to the board next Thursday during the public session, where we hope to secure the board approval prior to council review, and again, hopefully approval shortly thereafter. As the chief mentioned, the business plan really formed a big piece of what our strategic priorities are and what the focus of the budget would be. And as a result of that extensive consultation, we identified 3 priorities, as you see depicted here: community safety, community well-being, and organizational capacity. This business plan is the board's plan, and it guides the police in terms of strategic direction for the 3 years. These priorities are often new or in addition to existing capacity, and in some cases, they require an investment in people and technology to ensure we're more effective in what we do. I use that term investment deliberately to highlight that there is a return on that investment. That return is community safety, community well-being, and organizational capacity. But I would point out to you, when you consider what the police do on a daily basis, that the vast majority of our time is spent in non-criminal work. What you see the police engaged with, almost 60% of our day is spent on non-criminal calls for service. 41% is spent on criminal calls for service. Now, this is important because the police performance is measured on that 41%. We are compared against our other municipal police services, nationally, provincially, locally, and it's only on that 41%. Crime rate is 41%. What isn't captured is the 59% of the non-criminal work that can sometimes comprise 80% or more of our time. And sadly, we are seeing increases on both sides of that particular wheel. On the criminal side, break and enters, frauds, theft of vehicles, theft under 5,000, and human trafficking are all on the increase in the past year, as reported by StatsCan. And on the non-criminal side, as won't appear in any StatsCan reports, are increases in mental health calls, missing person calls, check welfare, medical calls, including overdoses, and motor vehicle collisions. So out of that 41%, how do we stack? StatsCan released their crime rate indicators and police performance metrics in July of this year. And as I have here on the screen before you is the crime rate for the City of London, the London Police Service, per 100,000, dating back to 2009. Starting in 2014, we took a bit of a upward tick as far as crime rates go. We are above both the provincial and the national average. And this is one of those cases where you don't want to be above. This is one where you want to be below, and unfortunately, we are above that line, and there's a host of reasons for that. You know, the City of London is a big city, and it attracts people. We have services here that attract people, and so that often will lead to unexpected crime rate increases. Now, on the non-criminal side, we know that there are certain social determinants that have an impact on our resources, specifically mental health, substance abuse, and unemployment, homelessness, poverty. They impact us in 2018 to approximately $18 million, or 8,200 people hours were spent on mental health crisis calls. Again, that's not referenced here in the community safety crime rate indicators. This is work that doesn't get measured anywhere else but by the police. And we know from studies done by the ministry that the City of London's criminal justice system is overburdened with low-level offenses, and with young adults between 18 to 25 years of age. As a measure of efficiency, we are one of the pilot sites for the justice centers to try and divert some of these criminal activity, low-level criminal activity out of our court system into wraparound care centers where we can get people the help that they need and hopefully prevent and reduce recidivism rates. Because our workload drivers include mental health calls, and it's a population that's disproportionately involved with the justice system. And London is experiencing the highest rates of this population in Ontario. That comes from a Ministry of Attorney General research. So how does that impact us? Well, it impacts our response times. The number of calls waiting for responses continue to climb. On average, there are 44 calls waiting for the police officers who are starting the 5 p.m. shift. So as majority of citizens are getting off of work or arriving home at the end of the day, and we're just getting started. At 44 calls, imagine walking into an emergency room and having 44 people waiting to be seen before you. That's going to impact customer service, and that's going to impact member wellness. There are additional pressures on us that the calls for service impacts. On the back end of the justice system, with a Supreme Court ruling referred to as the Jordan decision, we have increased pressures regarding the preparation and presentation of court cases, which impacts our requirements to disclose information sooner in the process. That is a pressure because our officers are spending more time preparing for court in a shorter amount of time. The good news, however, is that our responses to Code 1 or priority, those life-threatening calls for service, have remained constant at approximately 5 minutes and 41 seconds. The vast majority of our calls are Code 2 calls, also incredibly serious, but not necessarily considered life-threatening. Unfortunately, Code 2 and Code 3 calls are seeing an increase in response times. The investment we're seeking in this budget will assist us in policing better. It will help us to be in the right place at the right time with the right resources. Because we know that we're not keeping pace with the staffing ratios to population that existed in 2010. The dotted line there depicts 2017, when we started to rely on assessment growth for the police growth, matching, of course, the percentage of population to police ratios hasn't been able to keep pace. As a result, as you can see, we have a gap of 111 officers should we have kept pace with the 2010 ratios. So where are our police officers? Well, London Police has an authorized complement of 607 police officers. However, at any given time, 438 of those are only available. Now, we're all entitled to vacation, holiday, time off. So at any given time, almost 84 officers are away on holidays. The gap of 84 that's highlighted includes all the aspects of policing we can't control. Mandatory training, sick leave, LTD, leave without pay, WSIB claims and injured on duty, various other bank time. There's 84 officers who are off beyond our ability to control. So what does that result in? Officer burnout. We're forecasting a 33,000 hours of overtime for our sworn members this year. Almost 13,000 hours of overtime for our civilians. Civilians in our call center, the ones who are responding to you. When you call 911, they're the ones who are on the other end of that phone. Almost 13,000 hours of overtime to support the staffing required. The Police Association of Ontario had put out a study that burnout is on the rise. So how are we going to mitigate that burnout? We're requesting additional baseline officers, as noted on the slide here. 5 officers in 2020. We're requesting 2 officers in 2021, 2 officers and 2 civilians in 2022, and 5 officers and 4 civilians in 2023. We're asking this growth in our baseline to bring us closer to the resources we need. Future year predictions have been noted, but exact placement haven't been identified yet. We believe that the public will understand that the needs to identify policing complement should be based on workload and workload drivers. To identify year 2, 3, and 4 growth positions this far in advance would not be responsible. We need data, and we need analysis of that data to drive our future growth predictions. We must remain agile and responsive to demands. We are an evidence-based police service, and we believe that that evidence will drive our future needs. A workload driver today, even predicted today, is not necessarily the workload driver in 4 years. So what will these 20 officers over 4 years, 20 members over 4 years do? They'll reduce that gap. We're still below that 2010 ratio, but it'll bring our gap down to 65 officers. And even with those additions, as I said, we're not quite at that 2010 ratio. Workload continues to increase for our staff. Population continues to increase. Staffing levels are not keeping pace. The increasing pressure on our officers affects quality of life, not only for our members, but also for those in the community and their perception of safety in their community. It really speaks to the value our members contribute towards managing the challenges in a difficult environment. Now, as I said, we're an evidence-based, fiscally responsible police service, and we believe taxpayers get good value for their money. So we've introduced a number of enhancements and efficiencies throughout the years, including the enhanced service unit, a calls for service review. What are the calls that police don't have to respond to on the front line that could be diverted elsewhere? Mental health diversion, handover protocols with the hospital to increase our ability to get out of a hospital when we're dealing with somebody with mental health. Online reporting and reallocated positions within the organizations. Positions that 4 years ago were identified as being important future workload drivers that, as I said, are not reflective of the current workload drivers of today. As an example, the enhanced service unit has returned almost 3,000 hours to the front line, or the equivalent of $177,922 returned to the front line. So what is the enhanced service unit? This is a unit staffed entirely of accommodated people. As you saw in one of the earlier slides, we have 84 people who aren't at work for one reason or another during the course of any given day. Those people are staffing the enhanced services unit. Those are the people who still can contribute in a meaningful way to the organization and to community safety. And they're helping us to return our frontline officers to the front line. So what's that mean to the average taxpayer? We've seen a version of this in the city's budget breakout. We've taken the police services component and highlighted that from the protective services, and we represent 18.1% of every dollar, taxpayer's dollar. That 18% goes to crime prevention, law enforcement, victims assistance, public order maintenance, and emergency response. I should point out that that 18% has only increased by 1.5% in the last 15 years. As I said, we believe the taxpayers in the City of London get good value from their police service. Reflected in that are the low policing costs here in the city. 2018 expenditures as a percentage of the municipal tax are represented here. As you can see, London is third from the left. We're the only lower cost is in Guelph and Chatham-Kent. On the far right, out of every dollar, 31.6% is going towards policing in Windsor. I've picked these particular police agencies because they're all Tier 1 agencies, much like the City of London. They are our comparables. The policing costs per capita are low in London. That gold bar indicates the national average for policing costs across this nation at $414 per citizen. In the City of London, we're at $293, approximately 29% lower than the national average. So we were given a task of bringing in a budget within the envelope provided to us of 10.8% over 4 years. And as you can see, we've met that task. In 2020, we will be asking for an operating budget of $114,740, or sorry, $114,740,372, or a 2.8% increase. As you can see across that bar, it takes us to 2023 where the increase will be 2.1%. These are forecast numbers. Pressures, of course, will come up throughout the years, and if we need to make a request for an adjustment, that comes to council each year. But we've come under the 10.8% envelope that we were presented with. On the capital budget side, we believe that we're making an investment in our future. We have 4 pillars that which we are attributing capital budget investment: vehicles, equipment, facilities, and technology. Over the course of 4 years, we anticipate an approximate investment of $9 million for vehicles to replace our police vehicles, replace our light armored vehicle, fuel, and the remotely piloted aircraft system. Some call it a drone. It's not a drone. Drone is military. This is a remotely piloted aircraft system. Equipment includes upgrades to portable radios, furniture for our officers to sit at, uniforms, and replacement of firearms. We're looking at for short-term lease space for facilities as it forms part of our facilities plan. Our facilities at 601 Dundas are bursting at the seams. With an organization the size of the London City Police, we're housed in one facility. Quite simply, it's no longer meeting our needs. So we're looking at short-term lease space to alleviate those pressures, a longer-term training facility. We'd like to expand our headquarters, and there are much-needed renovations. When the headquarters was renovated last, there was a constricting of budget, and we were unable to complete the renovations that were originally forecast. As a result, there are still pieces of those parts of the building, including our cell block, that remain as they were in 1974. Technology, as I said, is an investment in the future. It's an investment in your police service to ensure that we have the right resources to put our people in the right place at the right time. Technology investments include business intelligence, various information technology. We have a mandated requirement to prepare for the next generation of 911, which will put significant pressures on your police organization when people will be able to text in 911 calls, provide other forms of communication for 911 that doesn't currently exist. And then to provide some oversight and risk management to the front line, a real-time operations center. In short, that is your operating and capital budget presentation for 2020 to 2023. And we're available to answer any questions should you have them.
Thank you very much, Deputy Chief Betts. So just look to board members first, just to see if there's any questions about the presentation or the draft budget, and then we'll open it up to members of the public. Go ahead, Jeff.
Deputy Chief, thank you very much for the presentation. A quick question as it relates to workload impacts on response times. You mentioned 44 calls in the queue on average at 5 p.m. shift start. Where did that peak out at this year?
I would, not having the chart right off the top of my head, we would easily, not uncommon to see 120 calls sitting in the queue at any given time at a peak. And that, if you, it kind of conceptualize what that means to officers when they check on, they have an MDT, a computer in their car, and they check on only to be page downing, hitting the page down to see the workload that's in front of them in a given day. So Deputy Chief Betts speaks to those workload drivers and the impact, but the impact to mental health. And what is that? How does that felt? What's that felt sense when our officers have that volume to begin with at the start of a shift? So we would see easily 120 if it doesn't surpass that.
And what length of time would a typical citizen wait for a response when there's 120 calls in the queue?
So all of our calls for service are triaged, right? So we look at what is the significance of the call, what is the risk, and how do we prioritize those on an emergency level. So we will call them a code 1 call, would be an emergency response call. That's when an officer responds with their lights and sirens on. Then next step down, although still incredibly significant, is a code 2 response, and then code 3s. So oftentimes the code 3s, there are days where they're over a 12-hour period before we can respond to those. Again, those are triage. Sometimes the citizen has asked us, you know, if you guys can't respond in this window, could you please come later? And we, of course, accommodate that. We would like to see our code 1 response. You heard our deputy chief speak. That's about your 5-minute mark. But we have seen over time that our ability to respond to code 2s is creeping up. And of course, the code 3s, the lowest priority, although very significant to the community, we're seeing quite an extensive call time on those.
I have Chair Salee. I'm just looking to others for any questions. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Just some technical questions for now, and then I'll have some comments later on. Deputy Betts, could you describe, you know, when you talk about the 60%, how much of that would you say, if any, is mandated? And I think I already know the answer to my second part of my question, which is, what happens if, what would you predict if we just chose not to respond to those 60% of those calls? Because from my understanding, those are not core functions of our your responsibilities, but those are things we have to do because if people don't do it, then there's going to be a big gap in the community. So I just think it's helpful for the public to understand that you guys are being downloaded a lot of this work, so.
Thank you, sir. Just before I get to that, I just let you know there are currently 90 calls sitting in the queues for service. The answer to your question is, we have a statutory obligation to respond to some of these calls. We are the only agency that is authorized to use the force necessary in certain situations that's required. We can't download this in some cases to other, you know, community groups, for example. You know, we have a mental health call, a person in crisis. If there's a concern for violence, the police have to attend. We can't escape that obligation. Once we have somebody in our custody and they're apprehended under the Mental Health Act, we are not allowed to leave that person until the hospital takes possession of that individual. So we're obligated statutorily to have possession of that particular individual, ensure their safety, ensure the safety of those folks in the hospital. We simply can't escape those requirements. They're not all necessarily non-core. I mean, victim assistance is a core function of policing, and some of these calls will be victim assistance related, right? Crime prevention. Our mere presence is preventing crime. And when we can get into the community, when we can be more proactive, when we're not responding to calls nonstop, we expect our officers to be involved in crime prevention, and that's being out there, being seen, communicating with the community, communicating on foot, getting out of their cars and engaging with citizens. So those are the things we'd like to do more of, but we are engaged, and they're core functions of policing, but we're engaged in statutory obligations in relation to certain other pieces of legislation that we cannot escape.
And just a follow-up to my question, so, and thank you for that. I know you guys and the chief himself, I know in the past I've had conversations with the ministry, with your Ontario Associations of Chiefs of Police, with having these conversations about the non-core roles and the taxing additions that's being added to our police services. I guess my question is, and you might not have the answer, but is there an opportunity for this police board to continue to advocate to the province to look at the formulas? Because when I hear funding is given to certain communities, they'll look at another community that maybe isn't facing as many or as significant crises that London is facing, like, for example, the opiate crisis, and many of these other things that aren't those that aren't reported to Crime Statistics Canada, and which do take up calls for service and do have an impact on us being able to respond to the community and to deliver the level of service. So I just wanted to know, do you think there's an opportunity? I know in the past I've advocated with the province, but for them to kind of look at those formulas, whether it's, or do we need to talk to Stats Canada to open that up? So through the chair, I'll ask that question.
Well, Stats Canada is just going to be our recorder of information and data, and I sit on the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, Police Information and Statistics Committee. I'm the co-chair of that committee, so we're constantly looking for data points to help us drive decisions and future dollars through Public Safety Canada and Justice Canada, and then down to, and my role includes being the liaison with the federal, provincial, municipal deputy ministers. So I have an opportunity to advocate on behalf of London in those situations, and with regard to the types of workload drivers that you're speaking of. We know that we were recently, and I know it was brought up in the public session of the Police Services Board meeting, subject to a significant decrease in grant funding, provincial grant funding, just over $638,000 that we use to provide core services to the folks here in the City of London. That is funding that we were putting towards foot patrol that we now have to allocate from within the operating budget elsewhere. So there's an impact on our budget because the funding has been restricted on that particular. So always welcome advocate to any level of funding. We continue to seek out grant opportunities where we can, and then I continue to advocate at that CACP level.
And my other question, a separate question, and I'm not sure if I'm not sure if the chief wanted to add to that, I think.
I think just to your original question about advocacy, I've said for a while now about my contact with the ministry is that a lot of these problems that are turning into police matters are probably rightly belong in other sectors, primarily healthcare and housing. So we deal with mental illness and addiction and homeless individuals who, for whatever reason, have contact with the police. That contact is required because we're getting called, obviously, and it may not be criminal, but our job is also to ensure people feel safe and secure. But if proper investment was made in those sectors, then those individuals wouldn't come into contact with police in the first place. So the advocacy should be for proper supports for people who need it.
Thank you, Chief, and thank you, Deputy. And I don't want to dominate the conversation, so I'll end by asking one other question. On the chart where we looked at the technology and we had the breakdown there, and it was 4 years, $7.5 million. Question, a hypothetical. If this was accelerated, let's say we were able to do this over 2 years, one, is that possible? And my other question is there any benefit as far as, my guess is that if we're able to have the technology in place, then we may be able to find savings in other areas because then the technology will create those opportunities of savings. So through the chair, I'll ask that question. And sorry if my voice sounds shaky, I got a cold.
We certainly would welcome the investment in technology on an accelerated rate. I would only caution that technology is only as good as the people. And if we don't have the people to implement, maintain, create, develop, and train for the technology won't be taken up and made to its fullest potential, made use to its fullest potential. So I think an investment in the front end will be certainly welcome, and then we have some efforts to undertake internally in order to properly leverage technology. There is no question, however, that the London Police Service was at the pinnacle of technology in policing, and we need to reclaim that position within the policing community, and with the support of the board, I think we can do just that.
Any other questions about the budget before we open it up to, go ahead, Mayor Holder.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, thank you to the Chief and Deputies for their presentation. I was struck by the crime rates in London being some 50% above the Ontario average and 12% above the Canadian average. Can I ask you to, perhaps through to you, Deputy Betts, to delineate the difference of that, of all the crimes in London, those that we might deem violent versus those are, I'm not sure if I say less violent, but ones that require the immediacy of the attention, those 5-minute type calls and the like. I wonder if you've got those statistics.
Sir, I don't have the complete breakdown for you from a statistics report. I can, however, provide you with the crime severity index information with regard to the municipalities and where we rate in relation to others. So the crime severity index, just at the most basic level, and I won't go into the full details around how it's calculated, but at its most basic level, it is the mathematical equation. It configures to the average number of days a person is sentenced in a particular jurisdiction against times the maximum possible sentence that could be awarded through the criminal code in your local jurisdiction. There are weighting factors related to types of crime. For example, obviously a homicide has a much higher penalty. However, robberies or street-level robberies are going to happen much more frequently, so there's a weighting as attributed to all of those. Fortunately, we stack better in comparison to our comparators, although we are above average in our crime severity index. We are by far not the worst either. Our non-violent crime severity index rating is 81, so that's typically considered property crime types of offenses, theft under, break and enter, theft of motor vehicles. Your violent crime is at 63 in the City of London for an overall average of 76 against our Tier 1 comparators. That's important for us to know as to what is driving business in each one of those particular areas. We'd like to see it overall reduced, Mr. Mayor, obviously, and I think we can engage with that. And there are certain activities and proactive activities through our problem-oriented policing approach that will help us to reduce the instances of those crimes.
So through the chair, then, just carrying on in that same light, I think it would be important, particularly where if I was looking at these crime rates standalone, London is the worst place to live in the world. That's not a quotable quote, please. But I mean in the sense that that the severity of crimes above the Ontario average is significant. That's why I'm trying to understand that relationship between severe and less severe on the crime severity index. And I appreciate that terminology. Because I'm trying to get a sense of time allocation as well. One of the things we often hear is where can and should police resources be used best? Are there alternatives, et cetera? And I'm mindful of what Chair Sali said when he talked about would something like IT moving that capital component up more quickly help us to, with the use of technology, force us to plan or have the tools to be able to plan better. You'll tell us more what that means, but it strikes me that there are some opportunities there, and simply to say that we just don't have the personnel to be able to handle that technology, I would find a little distressing. If in fact the ultimate opportunity that comes with that is that we're able to anticipate or use that technology to assist in either crime prevention or dealing with it. So I'd ask you to go back and reflect on that a little bit more. If I may, through you, Chair, a couple of things that come to my mind.
Mayor Holder, just before you
Yeah.
move on to another topic, I did see that Chief Williams wanted to weigh in on the first question. I wonder if we can go to him and then come back to you. Go ahead.
Thanks, I appreciate that. Just one thing to keep in mind about crime stats is they are a measure of reporting behavior. Okay, a lot of crime goes unreported, and I think this is, it's one measure of what's happening in our community. But make no mistake, we have a safe community, okay? But there's obviously crime that occurs. So, but it's a measure of reporting behavior. And for many years, when we've developed our budget, we've looked at metrics such as the average number of officers or charges that an officer lays in a year across all the Big 12 police services or across Ontario. And consistently, our officers are more productive. So I don't have the numbers for this year, but we found consistently our officers were laying more charges. So it doesn't necessarily mean there's more crime, but it's one indicator of activity, but it could just be a measure of how productive they are. The second thing about the use of technology, and I spoke about this at great length when going through the chief selection process, is we do have capacity, and there are IT tools out there that can take these vast amounts of data that we have stored in electronic filing cabinets and put it to use for us so we can predict these hot spots and these trends of crime and disorder when they're on the upward slope instead of on the downward slope. But we need the technology and we need the personnel to put those plans into place so that we can deploy our officers where they need to be, when they need to be there, instead of this random patrol reacting to calls, which has been going on for decades.
Mayor Holder, back to you.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate you saying that, because I think one of the things that we need to do is give our London community some comfort that we are not the crime capital of the province, and that it is a safe community generally. And I think that's important that people understand that. Deputy Betts made reference to the statistics of some 41% of officers' time is spent with criminal calls, whereas some 59% deal with non-criminal calls. And I wonder if we could focus on that a little bit, because I'm trying to get a sense of that 59%. If you could provide a bit more detail as to what that means, and is there any part of that that in some fashion either can be outsourced or dealt with in another fashion, or are we just burying our heads on this? Could you just go into a bit more detail on the non-criminal calls that our police, which with the commensurate staffing, is required to handle?
Thank you, sir. And I will also say we are not the least safe community in Canada by far. And that information is publicly available for anybody who is interested. The focus on non-criminal calls for service, we have seen dramatic increases in instances involving mental health and addictions and minor petty crime. Really is where we're seeing significant increases in our crime rates. We have taken steps to address the mental health situation by implementing and working with community partners to increase our capacity to respond to people who are in mental health crisis, a mobile response in which we will partner officers with mental health workers to try and provide that initial integrated response. We're working with the Ministry of Attorney General. London has been identified as one of the sites for a justice center where we will be able to leverage the partnerships within the community to ensure that we can provide wraparound services for those individuals who are involved in minor crimes, but the underlying foundation for that criminal activity might be based in addiction or mental health. Police intervention is often required, but is not the appropriate response, as the chief had mentioned, for many of these people. So this wraparound care where we can divert people out of the justice system, get them the care they need, will hopefully reduce our recidivism rates, which will have an ultimate impact on our calls and our demands for service. But again, those are really founded in non-criminal occurrence, non-criminal types of behavior that engage the police. It's a significant workload driver, but we are the 24/7, 365-day-a-year response that nobody else can provide. We recently saw a change in the way that calls regarding animal abuse has been shifted or is about to be shifted to the police from the OSPCA that we're dealing with that. So there is downloading, there is transfer. The police are there. We're always there. When you're in trouble, we answer that call, whether that be from a mental health perspective or not. And I hope that provides some answer towards your question, Mr. Mayor.
Well, I do appreciate that. I'm trying to understand the comment you just made about wraparound services. You made reference to the cooperation with the mental health partners, and I think that certainly mental health issues are one of the predominant considerations in our community, and how you deal with people with severe issues. And anecdotally, I know there's a lot of talk around the amount of time the police must spend with individuals, be they admitted to hospital, and you can't leave until you effectively are discharged by the hospital, if I could put it in those terms. Can you give us a sense of, I think of the Windsor partnership. Windsor has a program like this, and again, it's been reported that the impacts with mental health service providers going on calls has had some dramatic reduction of time requirements for officers. You may wish to comment on that if you have that information, but I'd like to get a sense, perhaps more globally, if you've got a statistic as it relates to, let's just speak to the issues around mental health. How much time in aggregate would you imagine, or how many hours do officers spend dealing with individuals with mental health issues, be they having been directed to a hospital or a mental health facility? Do you have any sense of what those statistics look like?
I'm just going to intervene briefly to say I know that the range of questions we could ask is quite broad, since they all affect the budget. But the focus of the meeting is really on the budget. So, yeah, I know that it's tied in, which is to say how much resources are being tied up with this, right? And so I just want to make sure that, especially in the answers, that we try and focus in as much as we can on what the budget implications of these things are.
Well, through you, Chair, the reason I'm asking the question is, for that reason, is to get a sense to what extent would these partnerships going forward, which my sense is that that there's more flexibility with the province in dealing with this issue as well, that the ability to release individuals into care of those who are professionals in mental health would have or should have some dramatic impacts time-wise. And so the question was directed specifically, do we have any sense if we did a forward-looking sense of those changes of legislation, but also the relationships with mental health, would that free up time, and do we have any specifics what that could relate to in terms of requirements for police officers to be in that 59% quotient and moving them to the 41 plus, where they do the other work that truly needs to be done as well?
I'd like to give a quick Cole's notes on part one of the question about partnerships. So right now we have an arrangement for mental health when there's a mobile mental health response team in a crash center that we utilize. So our officers involved in a mental health call, they have the option of calling this team, who come out and take over the call. There is another model out there where a mental health professional is riding with an officer and they attend calls. And sometimes they are proactive and they attend to individuals who have frequent police calls but aren't on that day in question, but we go see them with a mental health professional and try to head off, so get proactive and provide supports and steer them in the right direction so we prevent the calls from police from happening. So we're looking at a pilot with that. I can't say a whole lot because there's community partners involved and it's very early in the process, but it's something we plan on engaging with some partners on, and we'll have it evaluated from when we start doing that to determine if it's actually resulting in savings.
The mayor, and then we'll go on to part two. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, and this really goes, I think, to the heart of the question. We saw the projections of what's required in terms of officers and ultimately civilian staff in years 3 and 4. And ultimately, this being, from the city's standpoint, this most significant piece of our budget, and not unimportant, let's be super clear on this, public safety, I think, has got to be paramount when we deal with these issues. The question is how you pay for it. So what I'm trying to understand, or if you've thought of it as well, is with those projections of additional officers and civilians, do you, I'm sure you've thought of whether that just goes right to the bottom line of budget. Do we pay for it through assessment growth in some fashion, which would provide capital to be able to take care of those expenses? But I'm just trying to find a way to how we can thoughtfully basically pay for the need. And so I'm wondering to what extent you've considered, is this straight to the bottom line of the budget? Or do you see this ultimately with the budget, but paid for through assessment growth? And I wonder if the chief or deputies have any comments about how we might pay for this. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think the answer is actually it's going to be a combination. And because as we saw, we're not keeping pace by just utilizing assessment growth positions. And assessment growth positions we're going to require some flexibility as to how we implement or use those positions to where they need to go for the best implementation of some of these programs to deal with what you're speaking of. So there is no easy way for me to say, we're just going to do it through assessment growth and from the capital side of things. It really is a combination. Some of the investments in people that we're talking about here are to increase our capacity. They aren't necessarily going to be more boots on the ground, but they are going to be the supports and the pillars behind the scenes that allow our boots on the ground to do the job that they need to do. So it is truly a combination of both in order to ensure that we provide that effective response that you're looking for.
Well, on that basis, what I'd like to understand better then is, and would need to understand what the growth impacts are through, what the finances are available through assessment growth relative to just add-ons to the budget to see, as you'll appreciate, there's tremendous pressures, particularly as we come into next year, knowing that the province has indicated that that the share of downloading has never been greater. So I'm trying to find, you know what it is, we're trying to balance care and cost. That's what we're all trying to do, and care is a fundamental requirement of ours. That's why we talk about essential versus non-essential, if I can put it in that way, or to use some of your terminology before, the criminal versus the non-criminal calls that require so much time. And I'm just trying to find a way to strike that balance. And I think as we go forward, one of the things that we'll want to look at and need to look at in the very short term is the impacts and what we can do through assessment growth, what that would mean in terms of what we can do to support the personnel needs of the force as we continue as a city to grow. So I'm trying to get a feel for that. I'm not sure I'm there yet to understand what that is. So as we go forward, I think that's one of the things that I have to look at really hard to understand what the impacts could be relative to the staffing. That's more of a comment than looking for feedback from our colleagues.
It did sound a little bit more like a comment. I was waiting for the rising intonation at the end, but it didn't show up. Anyone else with questions? Chair Slee, go ahead.
Thank you, and apologies, my colleagues. I know I have a lot of questions. I'm wondering, Deputy Betts particularly, if you could kind of paint a picture for us, just briefly, of where we stand, London Police versus other communities on the technology side. I know I'm able to see online and kind of what other communities are doing or are hoping to do, and where we are at, because my sense that I get is that we have some catching up to do, and I understand that, you know, the chief has spoke about the importance of this, and you all the deputies have. So through the chair, I'll ask that question.
First of all, I want to say that our IT staff are phenomenal, and they have done so much for our service over the years, and I've seen it grown in the 27 years that I've been here, and Superintendent Mirrlees has been around a lot longer than that. I won't ask how long, but we were the first to have fully functional MDTs in our cruisers. There's a lot of different, mapping software. I can't say enough good things about them. We won an international award about 20 odd years ago. Very proud of that, and the people are phenomenal. But to be candid, it's an area we haven't invested enough in the technology and in the people in probably about 15 years, and that's on us, on the administration. And there are advances and technology that we could use that other services are using. Predictive software I keep mentioning, and the real-time operations center, and just converting, I always call them electronic filing cabinets, into actionable intelligence that the police officers can actually use in real time. So we need to invest in those pieces of technology and the people, because if we don't, we're going to be into this, and I'm not exaggerating, this 1970s, 1980s style policing when we're just chasing calls, and that doesn't work. It works to an extent, but you're always reacting. And with the volume and the complexity of calls that are happening out there, we're burning officers out. And, they're just spinning their wheels. It feels like they're just spinning their wheels. They make a difference, but that's what it feels like. So I am a huge proponent in investment in technology, but we have to have the people that use the technology and make it actionable for the front line.
Thank you, sir. And to build on the chief's part there, because we truly do have good quality people that are keeping the ship afloat here at the London Police Service. But we can do more. And as the chief said, we need to do more. There is technology that many police services are jumping on board with right now. They're all recognizing that we need to move away from a very reactive response based on antiquated methods of deriving work and workload to a more agile, a more evidence-based deployment of resources. We know, and I have experience with software that will allow us to identify where and when we should be in places. You know, what are our drivers? What time of day are people committing crimes? Right down to what time of day are people committing residential break-and-enters versus commercial break-and-enters? What time of day, what day of the week? Where to put our officers and where to put those resources. The technology exists. We are fully supportive, and we will be seeking the board's support to push for the implementation, acquisition first, implementation and adoption of that technology by the front line. There is a thirst for it, and I think it's in keeping with where we are technologically today. We have some catching up to do, but I know that once we do, the citizens of London will be well served.
Thank you both, and I echo your comments about the staff we have and what they've been able to do with just the limited resources they have. So thank you for those, the superintendents and all you guys for attending. So keep up the great work, and I'm going to, when I can, at appropriate time, maybe ask the board for a motion. So I'll wait for the chair to give me that opportunity.
Well, once we wrap up questions from the board, we are going to go to members of the public to get their questions and comments. We haven't forgotten about that. I'm not sure. I see the city manager and also the treasurer. It would be a bit odd if they were to come up to the mic, but I guess it's possible. I had a couple questions that haven't been covered yet, and I just wanted to ask them. First, obviously, a huge percentage of the budget is personnel, and I wanted to ask the administration, could you just explain how you go about trying to estimate what's going to happen with personnel costs? There's a lot of things happening, right? You've got the collective agreement that's influencing the cost of officers. You've got changing number of officers, other things that are going on with retirements and so forth. I just wonder if you could address it because it's a big chunk of the budget, and I think it's helpful for people to understand how that happens.
It's a really good question because salaries and benefits are well over 90% of our budget. So Kim's more an expert at this than me. She's been doing it a lot longer than I have. But we look at the actual pay rates. So if we're hiring, this is the baseline positions. Then it's not. They don't start at the top of their salary. Obviously, it's usually a graded pay system according with our salary grid, which increments up over the years. And so there's impacts on a group of officers as they become fourth class to third class to second class, etc. Those costs are reduced by leaves of absence, maternity leave, paternity leave, that we can predict somewhat, not entirely accurate all the time, and certainly by attrition. So we know, for example, in the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to hit a wave of people who were hired in 1990, 89, 92, who are retiring en masse. So that's going to affect how we estimate those. We estimate statutory benefit impacts, so CPP, EI, and other benefit impacts within the working agreement, which, you know, the price of prescriptions and things like that can change. So that's all calculated into salary and benefits. Unless Kim wants to throw anything else in. Sorry? Based on. Oh, right, and obviously it's based on the complement of the police service. So yeah, right.
Thank you. Yes, that part I knew. This all the other details, all the other details that I think are a bit more complicated to follow along, and how many things have to be kind of forecasted over the time period, especially since it's a multi-year budget. You know, I think it's important that people understand these are estimates about what we think is going to happen. Lots of things can impact them, right? Provincial regulations can change, federal regulations can change, and that can have impacts on some of these personnel costs. I wanted to ask about non-personnel costs, obviously a much smaller proportion of the operating budget, but are there any things in particular that are causing pressure on the budget that we should be concerned about? You know, sort of key important estimates that may or may not, you know, happen the way they are. That could be worse, could be better.
Thank you, sir. I'll start with the one that we've been talking about most today is technology. Technology is definitely a pressure. We do have an increase in licenses for software this year that are hitting our budget, just happens to come due this year. So there is a pressure there. Training costs, I spoke about mandated training. You know, every time the government introduces new legislation, there is mandatory training. Street checks, was mandatory training. When the new Comprehensive Ontario Police Services Act comes into effect, there will be mandatory training. Some of this training is required on a regular basis. So for example, the street check training came in 2016. At 3-year mark, all our officers have to undergo additional training related to that. So that's a pressure. That's a 3-hour online course that we're mandated to keep up and keep pace with. We have space limitations, so we do have pressures related to facilities and long-term facilities plans. Predicting the staffing, we need a place to put people. And what's the best and most appropriate use of space? What should we acquire? What can we make use of where we are now? We are literally turning hallways into offices at the moment. As we increase in diversity within our organization, we need space. We have quite simply run out of locker room for our policewomen in our organization. So we will be, we have pressures there to find new locker space, new space to meet our requirements, and of course funding that we spoke about. And as the mayor also mentioned, with the cutbacks and pressures, that shifts to a municipal burden for being able to provide these core services. So there's a pressure on us there. The police are expected to be everything. We know that there is a return on investment for being in the schools, but there is no funding that comes from that ministry for schools. We know that we're enforcing for safety under the Mental Health Act, but we know that there's no funding coming from that ministry for policing. The majority of the budget funding comes on the backs of the municipal taxpayer. Very little is transferred to us through federal and provincial. So there's a lot of pressure downward on our budget, and that's why we believe we've presented a responsible budget to meet the demands.
Thank you. And you mentioned this earlier, and this is my sort of second last question. It's partially addressed, but in terms of the changes to the provincial grant programs, I wonder if you could try and put that number in a term that's sort of more meaningful in terms of officers. You know, I know what the wage rate is for an officer, but it's not just that, it's benefits on top of that, and sometimes even vehicles and all kinds of stuff that would come along. So I wonder if you could just give us a sense of, with that kind of magnitude of reduction, what is the sort of impact on the complement?
At 640,000, you're probably looking at 5 people, 5 full-time equivalents.
Okay, last question. In terms of the staging, the timing of the base budget position increases, could you maybe speak to why it's staged that way? Is sort of they had a lot at the end of the 4-year period and fewer in the middle? And I just wonder if you could address that without getting into all kinds of details, because some of those positions, where they're going to go, you might not know yet at this point, but I wonder if you could just speak to the timing of those.
So at its most basic level, we're smoothing out the impact to the budget at the bottom line by pushing some of the hires towards the end of the 4-year term. We know that we have some heavy investments at the front end of the budget. We knew we need some immediate pressure lifted from the front line, which is why we've asked for 5 this year. Next year, because there will be incremental salary increases associated to hires, there's fewer people. As we get towards the end of 2023 and into that budget, we're into a new contract. So we know that there's going to be some pressures related to that. So building in some space to allow and to accommodate that, and this smooths out the overall impact across 4 years.
Okay, well, that's it for me, but I do see I succeeded in generating another question from the mayor. Go ahead.
As only you can, Chair. I'd like to come back to that question of assessment growth. We heard that we're looking for 14 net new officers, 6 net new civilians over 4 years. What I'm trying to do, being mindful of our budget and the impact on the taxpayers, has been rightly pointed out, how much of that hiring of that 20 personnel do you presume would be covered by assessment growth?
Sir, none of those members are covered by assessment growth.
Sorry, please.
None of those officers and civilians are covered by assessment growth. Those are additions to the baseline in order to try and narrow the gap between the population and the police ratio. Those are all baseline growth positions over and above assessment growth.
So there's X number.
Right, so there, we have predicted, well, we've asked for 10 this year, and we're predicting an average of 10 each year for the assessment growth. If that's a risk, of course, an assumption, but that's what we're basing our formulas on.
So to be clear, we're talking about 20 net new plus 40 net new based on assessment growth over, and is that all, would that 40 based on assessment growth be based on obviously on top of the 20 net new, that's, you're anticipating the 40 will come out of assessment growth. So you're really looking at 60 new personnel. What's the breakdown of that 40 between officers and civilians?
I will say just briefly, this discussion is really on the multi-year budget, base budget. The future assessment growth cases will come forward in future years, so some of them we don't even know what they say yet. Although it sounds like we have a high level. So I'm not sure how much we can talk about those ones like 2021 assessment growth in 2022, but go ahead if there's an answer to the question.
Well, may I just add to your comment there? We looked at the 33,000 hours of overtime. I'm not sure if that was specifically to officers or officers and civilians. The 20 net new presumably gets you pretty close to that if that's done over some period of time. And you're right, Chair, that assessment growth, who knows exactly what that number is going to be. So 10 could well be a tentative number, but I'm just not sure if there's any balance one could find between the requirements that we have to provide the service that we need as a police service, and whether there's some implications associated with the hiring based on assessment growth. I know that could be a what-if type question, but I'm concerned about how you find that balance, and I'm not sure what that is. I'd have to delve into the numbers a little bit more. It's an observation, and I'm not sure if the chief or the deputies have any comment on that as well.
Looks like Chief Williams would like to say something. Go ahead.
First of all, we never take the future years of assessment growth for granted, obviously. It's year by year. We understand that, although we do plan out. We have a strategy for the next 3 or 4 years and where positions could land, but that's very, very fluid, like year to year and even month to month sometimes. We're aware that there is potentially a funding envelope available for us through assessment growth this year, and we've allocated 10 positions for assessment growth. They're not all frontline. Some of them are technology positions. So there's five sworn officers and 5 civilians. But it's a bit simplistic with respect to quantify the number of hours of overtime we could reduce by just putting those officers on the street. It's not as easy as that. It may not even be, immediately noticeable. They have to be trained. It takes them, over a year to get an officer in a cruiser, where he or she is answering calls and actually being productive. And again, we can keep adding officers, but there's a backbone to the organization that nobody sees, and it is neglected sometimes, and that's the IT and the support staff and the civilians that are very important. So that's why you don't see 10 sworn officers in assessment growth. You see a balance, and that balance is crucial to more measured growth.
Sorry, I feel like it's a little bit of ping pong here, and I don't mean it that way, but so I look at the overtime costs, and I'm mindful of the 33,000 hours that were indicated as a real number projected for 2019. That's officer overtime, almost 13,000 of civilian overtime. If you netted it down, and if we said that we weren't going to pay any overtime because we didn't need to, and I know that's not realistic because circumstances happen, but what does that equate to in terms of the overtime cost, knowing that things like EI and CPP for an individual, those are fixed, so those would be add-on costs for new officers and additional civilians. Have you done a calculation what the 33,000 plus 13,000 of hours between police and civilian, what that would net out to, knowing that people work, call it 2,000 hours a week? Is it simplistic to say that if you didn't pay overtime, you could have 16 or 17 officers today and not that? Because I know that's not the right number, because overtime doesn't mean I'm just looking at basic numbers of hours though. 13,000 civilian hours, I'm trying to get to, if you didn't pay overtime or if it was significantly reduced because of hiring, and which would reduce burnout and allow people to focus on what they do. What would that mean in terms of real time, in terms of hiring today, if you use that overtime to hire new officers and new civilians today?
So Kim has done the math on that for me, but I also want to comment on something, and it's approximately 25 members would be the hire. As you mentioned, not, and I like where you're going. I like this, Mr. Bear. I like the thought of hiring more people. It's unavoidable for the overtime. Court will sometimes drive us into overtime. Late calls for service will drive us into overtime. That 12,000, almost 13,000, a lot of those overtime hours are in our communication center, where you know, we can't stop putting bodies in chairs to answer those calls for service. So 25 is the number. If you were in a perfect world able to distill and remove all requirements for overtime, but it's not achievable anytime soon, based on the gap, the hiring gap from the time we hire a member until they are qualified. If it's an officer, over a year to get them qualified before they can get onto the road by themselves. When it's a communicator, it can be longer than that, because there is a specific skill set associated to call takers, and again to the dispatchers, that it's not just a job that we can walk into. Yeah, we also have pressures with regard to minimum staffing levels that are in our working agreement. So there's a component that's associated to that as well. There are other costs for which we just don't have the staff for. For example, court security. We are mandated to provide court security. The chief is obligated to do so and to consider court security under Section 137 of the Police Services Act. And when the Ministry of Attorney General adds courthouses, courts, justice centers in which there are going to be judiciary members present, we are obligated to provide security. That may come, if there isn't a staffing available to provide that, at the cost of overtime.
Thank you, Deputy Chief Betts. That problem is going to occur, though, whether we hired to try to offset overtime requirements, or whether we had to hire, or we had the support to hire the 20 officers and, 14 officers and 6 civilians over 4 years. There's still going to be that time gap where individuals, to be functional, are going to take the time it takes, and I get that. But it seems to me that in our small business, we pay overtime. But there comes a time when we say, what's more effective? Sometimes it is better and sometimes even cheaper to provide some overtime. But I'm particularly concerned about the comments around burnout, and I think that's quite real. And for the sake of our officers and civilians, I'm very mindful of that. I don't think we restrict the hiring as much as we probably say restrict the budget. But it seems to me that if you had those individuals, wouldn't there be a notion of trying to be able to offset the overtime requirements by having people still within the budget envelope? At some stage, that's got to balance out, because otherwise, the burnout will result in, which I think is quite real, will result in additional impacts around things like PTSD, short, long-term disabilities, or people just quitting because they say, I've had enough. And it could be all the above. So I'm very empathetic to the challenges, but I'm wondering if, at some point, if you don't have the individuals, the overtime problem never goes away, the burnout problem never goes away, and there's got to be, at some point, there's got to be a point where the two come together, where we'll have enough staff knowing that we're going to have some overtime requirements, but not to the extent that I see here, unless this average here is typical with police forces. I don't know, and you might want to speak to that. It just strikes me that we're not finding that balance quite yet, and especially with the lead time to hire these people. I get the challenge. I'm just wondering if you've got any thoughts as to whether you'd ever imagine the overtime becomes evened out by hiring, by having full-time staff to offset that challenge.
I'm in real quick. I know and appreciate what you're saying. The reality is that there'll always be a lot of unpredictable overtime in police work. We could have a major event, and we've had a few in the last few months that obviously nobody could predict. And officers, you know, doesn't matter how many officers you have on the street, they can't leave. They have duties to complete that only they can complete. And that's the reality of running a police service versus a, you know, a private business where you have a lot of control over the work. We have no control. Or very little control over the work. So there's always going to be overtime. I believe that if we, again, if we close that gap which is on one of the slides there, we can mitigate that, you know, to the extent possible. What those numbers look like, I don't know, but the gap is substantial, and our officers are getting burned out. So that's the reality.
Okay, I don't see any other questions from board members. Thank you for covering a very wide range of topics in the questions. I am going to go to members of the public now to see if anybody has any questions for the LPS administration about the draft budget. Just come on up to the mic and give your name, and then you've got 5 minutes. Go ahead, Mr. Robson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to address the board. And mine are more comments, I think, than questions. And I think, thank you, Mr. Mayor, for basically leading me off and where I wanted to go in my comments. And that is in relation to officer stress and burnout. And I think even in terms of finance, it makes sense to invest in resources. If you take the human cost out of the measure completely, even in terms of finance, when you're talking about members who are going off on sick leave, WSIB, whether it be PTSD or another OSI, or whether short-term or long-term disability, there's a greater cost in that than there is to put the investment in the officers up front and invest in those resources. One thing I noticed, what was not addressed so far tonight was the Chief Coroner's report that recently came out, and the recommendations from that Chief Coroner's report in relation to the effects of officer suicides. And there were 14 recommendations in that report, not hundreds, 14. One of those recommendations centered on appropriate staffing levels as having a direct effect on officer wellness, health, burnout, and suicides. So I want to put that towards your information, towards your attention, and suggest that you consider that. And that fits in where I appreciate where the board some months ago passed a motion that they wanted to do whatever it took, and I'm paraphrasing, mind you, to acknowledge and mitigate the mental health of all members of the London Police Service. I greatly appreciate that that motion was put forward, and there were some positive steps taken forward. But again, in terms of budget and in terms of officer workload and burnout, that has a direct impact. I also like to thank Mr. Lang. He brought up the question, and it was just addressed tonight in terms of those calls for service. The context I put it to in some routine is officers spend a lot of time on the beach. That's what our frontline officers do. They spend a lot of time on the beach, and they're shoveling sand off that beach. And every day, their job is to show up at work and shovel sand off that beach. It'll never be done. And that is a daunting task, and it does start to wear on you. Now, they're not shoveling sand off the beach. They're responding to domestic violence victims. They're responding to other victims of human trafficking and other types of crimes. They're responding to mental health crisis and overdose. They're doing that every single day, and right now they're out there trying to answer 90 calls for service. They will not get that done. They recognize they work their hardest to get that done, and they come to work every day, and they recognize today they will not get that done. So what they do is they go, okay, there's 90 calls in the queue. I need to try and get that done today. So there's a call waiting. I'm not going to actually complete the call that I'm doing right now. I'm going to leave all that administrative work hanging over my head. Send me the next one. And when I get done the next one, what I need to do in terms of triage, park that one and send me the next one. So all of this work and pressure is just stacking on their shoulders and mounting every single shift while they are trying their best to get through 90 to 120 calls in the queue per service. and they will not get there. And they know that, and they're working their damnedest to do it, and they'll come back tomorrow and do the exact same thing. The other comment is around the mental health calls and the 60% of 59% of the calls for service. And Mayor, you made a comment about offloading. And I noticed Mr. Hayward stepped out of the room, but I wanted to ask him a rhetorical question. If he's ever had any experience with any of his unions that have asked him to take away jobs, because I've been begging for that for decades. I know the administration's been begging for that for decades. We don't want the mental health file. Please take it off our hands. I'm not going to get into a lot of sort of name calling and finger pointing. I'm going to suggest every member of council pick up the phone and ask them, how does the officer handoff in terms of mental health work in London? When an officer arrives at an emerge with a mental health patient, what is the protocol that's been agreed to by LHSC and the London Police Service? Now tell me what happens. And I think you might be surprised to learn what exactly happens there and what the effect is on how much time our officers spend in the emergency department with mental health patients. Now, in in terms of mental health calls, the reality is this is a provincial issue. We are aligned. We are aligned in terms of the administration, the association, the board, city council. This is a provincial mandate. This is a provincial onus. They need to pick up their share of this mandate and this share of the costs and stop downloading it on us. And when you break down the number of missing persons calls that are related to mental health, or the number of calls for service that are related to mental health, you would see it's quite significant. And until the ministry picks up that share, it's going to continue to be a burden on our police services board and our police budget. And I think we're aligned, and we could obviously work together on that front. And the last little piece I'd like to impart to you, subject to any questions you may have. The PAO, obviously you heard the comments from the Police Association of Ontario recently about the status of the number of officers per capita in Canada at the moment. And also the Police Association of Ontario did a survey in the last number of years on the expectation of the public as it relates to police budgets and their tolerance for paying their fair share of taxes in relation to police budgets, and their tolerance on what they would accept in terms of reduction in police budgets. And I can give you a spoiler alert, it's not great. The public is willing to pay their fair share for the police budget, and they're not willing to entertain any type of conversation or discussion about a reduction in police budget. So thank you very much for your time. I appreciate the opportunity to speak, and subject to any questions you might have based on my comments, I'm happy to answer those. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to look to see if there's anyone else who wants to weigh in. Go on down to this microphone here, sir. Just give your name, and then you have up to 5 minutes. Questions or comments?
My name is Doug Hogg. I appreciate the effort that the members of the board and the members of the department put in to the operating budget. I think the projections for 3 years for the operating budget is a good idea. But my concern is with the capital budget. There was a line item, almost missed it when it was coming up. There it is. Expand headquarters. Now, I'm very interested in that. You're not going to accomplish that in 3 years or 5 years. You would probably need 10 years of study before it's even brought up on the floor here. And I would suggest that we take a good look at the way things stand at the present time. 601 Dundas Street. I was on the building committee for that building. And It's not going to last forever, no matter what you do to it. We have over 800 people coming and going out of that premises. The building, as I see it, when we get into talking about expanding the structure of the force. In simple terms, I'm talking about precincts. We have a deputy chief, a new one, that's familiar with precincts. There are many different types of precincts in the province, different systems, and we would have to find one that's suitable for London. I would suggest that the capital budget be put on a 10-year basis, projection over 10 years. And that line item in 10 years could be started right now. It should be started with younger senior officers, those that are going to be around in 10 years' time. Many of the people I'm looking at won't be. I won't be, that's for sure. So I would suggest that a committee be formed right now, and this isn't going to be a lot of expense. A committee be formed of junior officers, the rank of probably first level staff sergeant, who are going to be around here in 10 years' time and who will be able to put together a plan that might be acceptable for the City of London, for the requirements of the city, for the way that we want to have our police building located. And my suggestion is that this committee within the force be formed by the younger officers that will be here when they get the job done. And over this next 10 years, they will be able to explore what the best solution is for the London Police Service. It may not be the way Toronto is, because their situation is different. They have boroughs, and that's how their precincts came about. The regional police forces, they picked up stations that were inhabited by the other forces that were part of the amalgamation. London here is different. The closest place that I can think of that might be worthwhile for London to look at is the city of Detroit. Detroit has 12 precincts, and they've been going since day one, since the day when Detroit was the 5th largest city in the United States, and it's downhill. And now it's gradually coming back. But those 12 precincts are there. The structure of the force is there. And it's a foundation that we have to look at so that we can continue in London.
Thank you very much, Deputy Chief Hogg. Sorry I didn't recognize you at first. I remember seeing you at the Chief's inauguration. Thank you. we're just going to take all the public comments, and then we're going to get answers to the questions and the comments that come in. Anybody else who'd like to comment or ask questions about the draft police budget for the next 4 years? Okay, I don't see anyone rushing the mics. Okay. Well, thank you very much. We'll go to get a couple of answers to questions that came up. Mr. Robson touched on a number of points. I'm not sure if anyone wants to respond to any of those. And then also the specific question that retired Deputy Chief Hogg had about the facility and the plans for that. Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. I'll start first with retired Deputy Chief Hogg. And thank you, sir, for your comments. They are insightful. And in fact, as you probably can appreciate, we have in fact got a 10-year capital plan. Kim has worked through that through the finances, and we've only focused on the first 4 because that's what we're focusing on for the purposes of the budget presentation. We do also have a facilities plan that started several years ago. So I appreciate your insight in that as well, which does, and it did consider options including stations other than at 601 Dundas. So there was some cost analysis that was applied to that, location analysis. What you see on that slide behind me with regard to the training facility is involving, looking at moving training away from 601 Dundas into a separate offsite location, and whether or not we can leverage partnerships with other emergency service providers to provide that, to put some relief on 601 Dundas and what's happening in that particular facility. Same as the short-term space. When the time comes to be able to execute some of these plans, subject to board approval on the capital budget, then, as you say, engaging some of the younger officers to be involved in that and oversee that and be a part of that will certainly be top of mind. So I appreciate your comments and your thoughts on that, because they're highly relevant. You are well aware, of course, of the expansion of 601 Dundas that was recently completed and nearly outgrown as soon as it was completed. We have a cell block that's in dire need of updating. I have an elevator that's not currently in service because it's the original elevator from that building that is in need. So thank you for your insightful comments. You have sort of lift the cover off of our facilities plan and something that we had presented to the board just last month for their consideration as part of this capital budget. So I appreciate that and your support on where we're heading with that. So thank you very much, sir.
Any comments in response to some of the issues that Mr. Robson raised?
Just briefly, I mean, Rick and I have spoken about these issues before, and I don't want to keep repeating, but I support what he says, and I agree with him. And I just think I might not have been eloquent enough before, but I mean, we talk about, the hours of overtime and the call time and the queue and everything, but we always have to remember, and Rick knows this better than anybody, these are humans answering the calls, and all these numbers and the stats we throw about are people, right, with families and loved ones, and they go home and they have their own life, right? And, we need to take care of them. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. I'm just looking. Go ahead.
Just, I also want to sort of echo Rick's comments with regard to appropriate staffing levels. And then I'm going to tie that back into the implementation of appropriate technology, because that's really what we need to drive. What are those appropriate staffing levels based on workload analysis, time of day analysis, time on call analysis. We just don't have the horsepower to do that at this particular point, but it's my hope that we can then bring some technology to bear on those issues so that we can right size what's the appropriate staffing in not just the front line, but across the organization. So we're engaged in some efforts right now to baseline things so that we can then look at when we can introduce technology and do some proper analytics. What is the appropriate staffing level based on a target value of time on calls for service? We simply can't have officers spending all their time responding to calls for service. They need downtime as well. They need time to engage proactively in the community. So we need to come up with an appropriate ratio that will allow us to determine what level of staffing in what areas of the city is appropriate to balance that workload for our members, as the chief said. they're people, and they can't continue. It's unsustainable the way it is. So appreciate your comments on that. Thank you, sir.
Okay, just briefly, I know that Mr. Robson, you raised the handover protocol, and I had an opportunity to see that in action last Friday. So on a ride along, last Friday's Thanksgiving, I'm not sure why we picked that date. It turned out that it was a very slow Friday. So I'm definitely going back for another ride along because I don't think that was a really good snapshot of what happens. But the very first thing we did basically was go to Victoria Hospital to see a couple of officers. So there are 4 officers there. 2 of them had been there for just over 5 hours with one person, and then the other 2 had been there for just over 4 hours. And you know, the way that the sergeant who was leading me on the ride along explained it, you know, part of it is to check in as a morale thing because people are just standing there in the hallway waiting and waiting and waiting, right? And they needed to be there. I mean, I'm not going to get into the details, but you know, they needed to be there. They couldn't just leave, obviously. But it was a lot of waiting around, and that's a lot of officers waiting for a very long time. And it didn't seem to be very unusual. And so I think the protocol is a good idea. How it actually works in reality, right? Like that's the difficult thing, and I think it's something we have to keep our focus on because it could look great on paper. If it doesn't actually work, it's not solving the problems, right? And it's not as though the issue, I think, is with the police service. It's a complicated thing, and I think we're moving in the right direction, but I think the question is how fast can we actually get there so it works as well as it can. Anyway, that's just a bit of an aside, not directly relevant to the budget discussion, but obviously having officers tied up with all kinds of other things waiting around doesn't help with the budget. So, colleagues, that reached the end of the sort of public input into this process. Obviously, as was described in the presentation, this is just one step along the whole way of the budget process. Anything anybody would like to bring up now? I heard the chair said he had some kind of motion for the budget committee. I'm interested to know what that is. And then we'll see if there's a seconder.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, you know, and as this, I guess I'll consider this as part of the debate part. So I'll just kind of lead off with some comments and thank members of the public for coming in and sharing their perspectives, as well as Mr. Rick Robson. And Mr. Rick did touch on an important piece with the Chief Coroner's report, had opportunity to look at that, as well as have discussions with other board members last Friday. In Toronto, where we did talk about that and the impacts of that and what we need to do in our responsibilities. And I do think we have a lot more work to do in that area. And I think, you know, I think hopefully in the technology side, that can address some of the concerns and, you know, provide some of the support that's needed. I do feel like we're asking our officers in London and anywhere in Canada to do a lot with very little at times. When I see the numbers of 60% of the calls that they're asked to do, which is non-police or non-criminal work, I think that is a concern for everyone, and that's a concern for every Londoner. And I also know what the expectation that Londoners have of the London Police Service, which is they don't want to wait 2, 3, 4 hours or half a day or the next day to hear back from London Police. But that's the very real reality, and there's nothing we can essentially do about that unless you want to make the proper investments. So I know I hear from my councillor colleagues very regularly when there's feedback saying, you know, we've waited for so many hours for my resident complaint for call of service. You know, I hear that very often when the students come back into town, and it adds to the calls of service. So without going too much further into my comments, what I want to do, you know, is ask this committee to recommend the first thing, which is for us to write a letter to the province to seek proper investments in those areas. But specifically in this letter, I want us to articulate what our real realities are here locally. You know, when we look at the 60%, what we're doing, and to ask the province to make those investments. I know in the past, the chief has worked with other members in the community as well as his board to write a letter to the province to talk about poverty and some of those other pieces. I feel that it's our responsibility to say more and to do more because the reality is it's not fair to our officers, and I don't think it's sustainable. And I think it's you know, there's going to come a point where we can't continue to keep asking them to do more and more and more when other communities, in fact, are getting more resources at times. And I see them working every day and trying to fit in their lunch breaks and missing their lunch breaks. And that's a very real reality. And I'm worried about morale and many other things. But I know they continue to work through. But the reality is, just in my short term, I've seen them having to fill more roles of work of paramedics, whether it's the opiate crisis and administering naloxone and other first aids. So we keep adding more to their workload. We keep adding more to their duty belts, and we're not responding to the root cause, which is it's someone else's responsibility, and someone else needs to do that that important work that's needed. But I'm thankful that our officers step up every day to fill that gap. And now they're going to be doing animal service work. So I mean, the list keeps adding, and it's not balancing off, and it doesn't make sense. And we come here and we have a discussion about the budget and we say, well, what can we do to find savings? So, Mr. Chair, I apologize. So that's my first motion, that letter. And then the second motion, which,
Chair Salee, could you just
Sure.
state exactly what your letter would be about, and then we'll see if there's a seconder for that part?
sure. So I wanted us to draft a letter to the province to highlight that there's a need for proper investments in the areas, specifically mental health, healthcare, and some of the areas that we might work, that the chief and administration might highlight to us that could benefit in reducing the 60% in the calls of service that they're currently being inundated with. And as well, I want us to specifically highlight what our real realities are here, which we've seen in the presentation, and just kind of reiterate that in a letter.
Okay, is there a seconder for that idea, advocacy to the province for investments in those areas that the chair has mentioned? This would obviously be a recommendation from our committee to the full board. The only members of the committee, I think, can actually make or move the motion, so that would be Mr. Lang, myself, Chair Salee. I think that's it. I'm not sure, are you on the budget committee?
Yes. I am not. No.
Yeah. So I look to my left, seconded by Mr. Lang, okay. So any discussion on that idea? All those in favor? Oh, go ahead.
I thought Councillor Slee was very articulate, but if we could maybe tighten that up a little bit for clarity, that might be useful. Just even a bit more.
Well, we will have the opportunity, I think,
sure
between now and the board meeting. If the language needs to be slightly revised or tightened up, we could do that at the board meeting.
Wonderful.
That makes sense? Yeah? Okay. Any other discussion? Okay, all those in favor? Any opposed?
Does a non-budget chair get to vote on that? Non-budget participant?
No, just budget committee members get to vote, so. I think it's looking good with 2 people out of 3. So, it looks like it's carried. Chair Slee, you said you had something else.
Yes, Chair. I know where I'm at with this, in particular the technology side. I want us to work aggressively to get at this, mindful that things take time and we want to do it right. But I do find that there's a significant benefit in accelerating this. So I won't ask the committee today to adopt it, because I know I'm just kind of throwing it on you and it could have some significant impacts. I know where I'm at. But what I'm hoping is committee will support that. We ask staff, and I know it's a short turnaround, to hopefully at the next upcoming board meeting to tell us what a 2-year versus a 4-year would look like, and the impact and what those benefits would be, specifically the capital and the staffing, because I think there's some real opportunity to make a positive impact. So I'll ask that motion that, staff report back at that time at the upcoming meeting, and then anticipate that I will be supporting a request for 2 years versus 4.
Okay, so this sounded like accelerating both the capital budget, but then also if there's associated operating budget impacts. That's what you're suggesting, Chair Salee. And the idea is to have staff report at the next full board meeting about that issue, what would be involved. Okay. Seconded by Mr. Lang. Any discussion? And certainly non-members of the committee are able to engage in the discussion. Chair Salee, I'd say it's looking good, so be careful with what you say. Go ahead.
No, I did want to ask you, through a question to you, to staff, if obviously if they're able to do that. So I want to ask administration if they're able to respond in that short time frame, and if they have any comments right now. I think that might be helpful.
Just for clarification, are you speaking specifically to the technology item in capital to move that into the 2-year time frame with associated staff? Is that where you're, okay. And we can turn that around by the meeting on next Thursday.
Okay. All those in favor? Okay, that's carried as well. Okay, that brings us to adjournment. If someone would like to move that. Mr. Lang, seconded.
Okay. Sorry. I just did want to make sure that any other members, if they wanted to further debate or receive the report, or just wanted, before we adjourn.
Thank you. Yes, we should definitely receive the report. Thank you for that. Mr. Lang, would you like to move receipt? Thank you. Chair Salee, thank you. All those in favor? Okay, that's carried. Now adjournment. I have it moved, seconded. Any other discussion? I had no one on my speakers list, so I thought we were done. And we are done. Okay, all those in favor? Okay, we're adjourned. Thank you very much. I know this is an additional meeting, an extra part of the process, and I think we certainly got into some great discussions. So I want to thank all the members of the LPS administration, especially Kim, for turning around all this stuff and getting it ready, and for everyone who attended, including members of the public and our city treasurer I see in the back corner. Thank you very much.